Over the last few lectures, we've looked at how hominins evolved over the last 6 million years or so. This time, we'll see the last step of this, how modern humans evolved in Africa and spread throughout the rest of the world. But the first step in understanding modern humans is to understand how we got here in the first place. So today, we're looking at the final stages of human evolution, which ultimately turned Homo heidelbergensis into Homo sapiens, and allowed Homo sapiens to replace the other late Pleistocene populations we talked about last time. I should make a brief note on terminology before we continue. In the last class, we discussed how modern DNA evidence has shown that Neanderthals should be considered a subspecies of Homo sapiens, specifically Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. Fully anatomically modern humans are classified as Homo sapiens sapiens, and this is the subspecies that this lecture is mostly about. But by convention, when Homo sapiens is used without a subspecies, most paleoanthropologists mean Homo sapiens sapiens. I follow that same convention, so over the next few minutes when you hear me just saying Homo sapiens, remember that I'm not referring to Neanderthals, Denisovans, or any other pre-modern population. It's just much more convenient that way. The earliest fossils that pretty much all paleoanthropologists agree belong to our own species, Homo sapiens, have been found in East Africa, the region that gave us most of the earlier important developments in human evolution, such as Australopithecines and Homo habilis. These fossils date to about 195,000 years ago, and many scholars agree that Homo sapiens evolved out of Homo heidelbergensis. Not all of them, though. Remember that heidelbergensis was proposed as a species name to label the transition between erectus and sapiens. The lumper school of paleoanthropologists, who argue for fewer species names with greater intraspecific variation, argue that Homo sapiens is best understood as developing directly out of Homo erectus. In most cases, this kind of taxonomic debate would boil down to semantics, but in the case of Homo sapiens, there's more at stake. You see, just because the earliest sapiens fossils yet discovered come from Africa, does not necessarily mean that sapiens is an African species. It just means that we happen to have found older fossils there. But it's possible that Homo sapiens evolved elsewhere and then spread to Africa, and in that case we're just missing the earliest fossils in other regions. So where did Homo sapiens first evolve, and how did it spread from there? There are three broad schools of thought about this final phase of human evolution. Until the 1980s, the dominant theory was the one now called regional continuity, and today it's primarily associated with Milford Wolpoff and his associates. Wolpoff today, and until the 1980s most paleoanthropologists, believed that Homo erectus populations throughout the Old World had evolved mostly in place into Homo sapiens. While some groups no doubt moved around throughout the lower Paleolithic, after the first great expansion of erectus, there was no evolutionarily significant migrations. Everyone settled down and became homebodies. Chinese erectus evolved into Chinese sapiens. African erectus evolved into African sapiens, and so on. In Europe, erectus evolved into Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, who were later replaced by anatomically modern sapiens from the Middle East. In all parts of the Old World, there was significant regional genetic continuity. Most sapiens genes were inherited from erectus populations that had lived in the same regions. That's why it's known as regional continuity. Each population was continuously in the same region. This theory, which was the best that they had some problems. The biggest problem was that it didn't explain how all those different populations underwent exactly the same sorts of evolutionary changes and didn't diverge from one another. Remember from the very beginning of the semester when we discussed the principles of natural selection. The eighth principle was that geographical isolation and distance plays a role in speciation. So if the Homo erectus in China were separated from those in Europe by 8,700 kilometers, one would expect them to experience different selective pressures. Eventually, they would evolve into different species. But that didn't happen, and they went through exactly the same sorts of evolutionary changes to become modern humans. Wolpoff counters this argument by positing a large degree of Paleolithic gene flow. Each community interbred with other communities around its periphery, forming an unbroken chain from Western Europe to East Asia and from Central Asia to Southern Africa. In this way, while people didn't need to move very far, genes could flow from one region to another over the course of many generations. This scenario, Wolpoff believes, is sufficient to explain why different Homo erectus populations did not diverge from one another. So you could summarize the regional continuity model by saying that it describes Homo sapiens emergence as all gene flow and no migration. People stay put, but they interbreed a lot. That theory began to be questioned in 1988 when Christopher Stringer and Peter Andrews published the Out of Africa theory, which is more formally known as the complete replacement model. In this theory of Homo sapiens origin, Homo sapiens evolved first only in Africa. Later, the new species followed in Homo erectus footsteps and migrated out of Africa, completely replacing earlier populations along the way. Everyone today is descended from this second major migration. Earlier Asian and European populations, like those at Jocodian and Cima de los Huesos, died out without leaving any living descendants. So how did Stringer and Andrews come to this conclusion? They did so by using an entirely new form of evidence for human evolution, DNA. Their study was the first time that DNA of living human populations had been used to answer questions of humans' evolutionary past. For the mid-1980s, it was beyond cutting edge. Using these new genetic methods, they and several other teams of scholars argued that all modern human beings from every region on the earth were descended from a single African woman who lived about 200,000 years ago. The evidence for this conclusion came from mitochondrial DNA. Remember that the mitochondria are organelles in every cell in the body, and they contain a second set of DNA separate from the nuclear DNA that controls most traits. mtDNA is extremely old, billions of years old. So it's essentially optimized by natural selection. For the very few cellular processes that it controls, there really isn't any better way of organizing the nucleotides. Because of that, mtDNA is not subject to significant selective pressures. The only thing that causes it to change over time is mutation, a random process that occurs at a known steady rate. Also, mitochondrial DNA is inherited from only the mother, which simplifies the process of using it to trace descent, since you're only tracking a single parental lineage. From each living person, male or female, a single line of mothers and grandmothers and great-great-grandmothers extends backward in time. When two people share a female ancestor, their lineages merge into a single line. Logically, if you go far enough back, everyone's mitochondrial lineages will eventually merge together at a single female ancestor. What Stringer and Andrews did is gather mtDNA from a wide sample of different ethnic groups from all around the world. No matter which two groups were compared, the DNA was virtually identical. Somewhere back in time, all those people had to share a common matrilineal ancestor, and the few differences among them had to be due to mutation alone. The common matrilineal ancestor donated the original mtDNA to her children, and her daughters then passed it on to their children in a slightly mutated form. Their daughters passed on a slightly more mutated form to all of their children, and so on. So the question is, how long has that original version of the DNA been mutating, if it's produced all the variation that we see today? Since we know the rate of mitochondrial mutation, Stringer and Andrews calculated that it would have taken about 200,000 years for those mutations to appear, and that date must be how long ago all modern people shared a common female ancestor. Other statistical analyses were able to locate this woman in East Africa. In this model, the so-called Mitochondrial Eve is not the only woman on Earth, of course. She wasn't even the only woman alive 200,000 years ago who still has surviving descendants. She's not even the most recent common ancestor of all living humans. The genealogical significance of Mitochondrial Eve is extremely complex, more complex really than we need to go into here. Suffice to say that, statistically speaking, there had to be someone, somewhere, some when that satisfied this criterion. She was in Africa, and she was 200,000 years ago. What surprised scholars was not that she was in Africa. We've known that we evolved in Africa since Raymond Dart found the Tong child in 1925. What was so surprising was that Mitochondrial Eve was so recent, much too recent for the regional continuity model to explain. That model would also have predicted Mitochondrial Eve lived in Africa, but much farther back in time, say 2 million years, before the first migration of Homo erectus out of Africa. But of course, that's 10 times older than the DNA evidence was suggesting. So out of Africa proponents proposed a radical new theory that about 200,000 years ago in East Africa, a biological speciation event had taken place. A population of Homo heidelbergensis had diverged enough from other groups that it was no longer capable of fertile interbreeding with those other groups. This new species was not a paleospecies, but a genuine biological species, and that was Homo sapiens. Sapiens then expanded throughout Africa, Europe, and Asia, and outcompeted the other Homo species it encountered, eventually driving them to extinction. Since the species could not interbreed with other populations they encountered, there was no gene exchange between them at all. In the 30 or so years since the original publications, the same sorts of genetic experiments have been carried out on the Y chromosome, which is inherited from father to son and is similar to mtDNA in certain ways. These studies have borne out the idea of a recent African ancestry for all living humans. Y-Chromosomal Adam lived in Africa about 100,000 years ago. Note how far apart in time he lived from Eve, though. So you could describe the complete replacement model as the exact opposite of the regional continuity model. That was all gene flow and no migration. This one is all migration and no gene flow. On the other hand, in the years since, new finds have chipped away at the strong out of Africa model. The story is not as simple as Stringer and Andrews originally believed. One of the most interesting finds is the Abrigo de Lagar Vehlo child, found in Portugal in 1998 and dated to about 24,500 years ago. Eric Trinkhaus, one of the foremost Neanderthal scholars, believes this 4-year-old child to be definite evidence of interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. That alone isn't enough to counter the complete replacement model, of course. Different biological species can sometimes interbreed and produce living offspring, like a horse and a donkey creating a mule, or a lion and tiger creating a liger. But those hybrids are always infertile and can't have offspring of their own. Since this child died at age 4, we don't know whether he would have been fertile on reaching adulthood. The complete replacement model predicts that he wouldn't have been. On the other hand, interspecific hybrids are very rare. If the child is a hybrid, then it's much more likely that sapiens and Neanderthals could not only interbreed but produce fertile offspring, which would invalidate the speciation event that out of Africa proposes. We also now have near definitive proof that interbreeding of some sort did take place between Homo sapiens and other pre-modern populations. Most significantly, Neanderthals. This proof is the DNA evidence we discussed last lecture, showing that modern non-African populations have 1.5 to 2.1% of their DNA inherited from Neanderthals. This suggests that soon after our Homo sapiens ancestors left Africa, They interbred with Neanderthals before spreading throughout the rest of the world. Those Homo sapiens who remained in Africa never met Neanderthals, so Neanderthal genes never made it into the African gene pool. Obviously, if Stringer and Andrews' biological speciation event had taken place, none of this would be possible. On the whole, then, after 30 years of arguing, what has emerged is a growing agreement among paleoanthropologists called partial replacement. Sapiens must have evolved in Africa 200,000 years ago. The fossils are there and the genes agree. Sapiens then moved out of Africa, meeting other species. Some interbreeding probably took place and some non-African genes entered the sapiens gene pool, but crucially, not enough that regional populations diverged from one another. Gene flow and a high migration rate among sapiens populations continued to mix the genes up enough to prevent further speciation. We are simply too young and too mobile a species for geographical isolation to have caused us to diverge from one another. In other words, the partial replacement model sees the emergence of modern Homo sapiens to be a mixture of some migration and some gene flow. This is a common pattern in science. You'll see one early theory going all the way in one direction, then a challenger that goes all the way in the other. But eventually the truth settles out somewhere in the middle. The truth of Homo sapiens' origin is somewhere in between regional continuity and complete replacement. So there's not much about the physical characteristics of Homo sapiens that you don't already know. Everything below the skull looks pretty much like it has since Homo erectus. Skull shape in our species is distinctive for its large cranial capacity, about 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeters on average. But remember that Neanderthals had an even larger brain on average. We have reduced brow ridges and less projecting faces, both due largely to smaller teeth. As the teeth have shrunk, the jaws have moved back to be more under the skull than out in front of it. And the chin is also a result of this process. It's the remaining leftover part of a much larger jawbone. The teeth have receded, but the jaw hasn't yet. The earliest fossils showing these characteristics come from Omo Kibish in Ethiopia and date to about 195,000 years ago, about the right time and place for Mitochondrial Eve. By about 100,000 years ago, sapiens had extended to sites along the southern coast of South Africa, like the Clossies River mouth cave. One of the biggest collections of early sapiens fossils comes from the Herto area of Ethiopia, about halfway between the other two chronologically, at about 160 to 154,000 years ago. These fossils are obviously Homo sapiens, but they still have some traits that are not completely modern. So Tim White has suggested they be classified as Homo sapiens idaltu, a subspecies, and, as is traditionally, fully modern humans are referred to as Homo sapiens sapiens. Outside of Africa, sapiens finds date as early as 130,000 years ago in Israel. As sapiens expanded south from Ethiopia to South Africa, they also moved northward at about the same rate. In Israel, Neanderthal remains date back to the same general time period, and there is evidence that the two species coexisted for scores of thousands of years, something the regional continuity model can't really explain. For example, the Neanderthal site of Taban is located less than 3 miles from the contemporary Homo sapiens site of Skul. By about 40,000 years ago, sapiens had reached Asia. The famous Zhoukoudian caves has sapiens remains in the upper levels, as do the nearby Tanyuan caves and the Ordos caves in Mongolia. Sapiens may have made it to Australia before China, though. All human remains and archaeological sites in Australia belong to Homo sapiens. No earlier species colonized the continent. And the earliest seems to be about 30,000 years ago at a site known as Lake Mungo. On the other hand, archaeological evidence and modern DNA studies suggest the continent was first settled around 55,000 years ago, and we're just missing the earliest fossils. This is interesting because it seems like we're lacking human remains from roughly the first half of the human experience in Australia. It's probably because of how successful the Neanderthals were that anatomically modern Homo sapiens did not expand into Europe as quickly as they moved into Asia. A comparatively populous, intelligent, and well-adapted Neanderthal population would have dissuaded early sapiens from moving northwest out of Israel, whereas the comparatively empty and warmer South Asia would have seemed much more inviting. After all, put yourself in your ancestors' place. You're in Israel moving north. You can turn left into Europe, where it's cold, full of giant, dangerous beasts, and already hunted by a populous and successful people. Or you could turn right into warm, empty Asia. Obviously, many early groups chose to move eastward. Nevertheless, by about 40 to 35,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were moving into Europe. These groups are often known as Cro-Magnon, after the cave in France where, in 1868, the first well-preserved Paleolithic skeletons were discovered. Cro-Magnon cave itself dates to about 28,000 years ago. This is another example of English mispronunciation, by the way. The more common English pronunciation with the hard G is just an anglicized version of the true French pronunciation, Cro-Magnon. Before we move on to look at Upper Paleolithic culture, I will mention one last Homo species, Homo floresiensis. We've already seen an entire documentary on this species, so we won't spend much time on it, but just to remind you, floresiensis was first identified in 2004, and it has remained controversial ever since. This species seems to have been only 3 feet tall when adult, with brains no larger than chimps. A consensus among most anthropologists is forming that Homo floresiensis is really a separate species and not just a diseased modern human. But recent analyses have suggested the fossils are much older than the roughly 18,000 years originally suggested. Current estimates date them to about 65,000 years ago. Still very young and in entirely the wrong place to make the small-bodied hominin fit into our understanding of human evolution. Currently, the textbook's insular dwarfing theory is the best explanation anyone has offered. But on to the culture of our Upper Paleolithic ancestors. Actually, not necessarily all of our ancestors. Because of the historical accident that many paleoanthropologists are of Western European descent, most of the foundational research into the culture of early Homo sapiens was conducted in Europe. That's what we'll be looking at specifically. But the European Upper Paleolithic is comparable to cultural innovations elsewhere in the world. The same sorts of innovations were being made around the world, just in slightly different forms or with slightly different timing. So we'll use Europe as an example of the sorts of cultural developments happening throughout the Old World during the same time period. First, in archaeological terminology, artifact assemblages that date to when Homo sapiens was in Europe belong to the Upper Paleolithic, the top Old Stone Age. Because of the differences in dating techniques in the spotty fossil record, we usually consider the Upper Paleolithic to begin around 40,000 years ago. The earliest sapiens fossils are a couple thousand years younger, but the margin of error for dating in this period is rather wide. The European Upper Paleolithic is divided into 5 technological industries. In chronological order, the Aurignacian, the Chatelperronian, the Gravettian, Solutrean, and Magdalenian. This whole period of approximately 30,000 years, from 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, was one of sustained technological innovation. As the Pleistocene came to an end, the environment and climate of Europe began to fluctuate more rapidly than it had for most of the Ice Age. This period, like today, was one of generally warming global temperatures, but climate change is not a smooth process. What really happened at the end of the Pleistocene, and what's happening today, is an increase in the variability and unpredictability of climate. Rather than a reliably cold and dry climate in Europe, the Upper Paleolithic would see decades of drought followed by a century of flooding, years of extreme heat followed by crippling cold snaps that might last decades. This is probably why we see so much technological change in the Upper Paleolithic. The environmental changes forced humans to innovate and change strategies to adapt to new conditions. Homo sapiens was able to adapt quickly and effectively to the changing conditions with new and more sophisticated technologies than had ever been used before. Neanderthals, on the other hand, appear not to have been as flexible and innovative. They eventually couldn't keep up, and they ultimately went extinct. One of the most significant technological changes introduced by Homo sapiens came in the earliest technological tradition of the Upper Paleolithic, the Aurignacian. This innovation was the increased use of non-stone materials to make durable tools. The Aurignacian introduced bone, ivory, and antler as common tool materials for the first time, and their use became more sophisticated as the Upper Paleolithic progressed. For the first time, our ancestors were looking at parts of animals and seeing the raw materials for making tools. This is really a big cognitive leap that Neanderthals never seem to have made. Chronologically later than the Aurignacian is the Chatelperronian. Chatelperronian tools are associated with the last Neanderthal populations in Europe. They seem to have adopted a few ideas from watching neighboring Aurignacian groups, adding those ideas to their traditional Mousterian toolkit. This would be the first significant technological innovations made by Neanderthals in about 100,000 years. It would not be enough, however, as Neanderthal populations died out soon after Chatelperronian tools appear in the archaeological record. Next is the Gravettian, which is again associated with Homo sapiens sapiens. These tools are interesting to specialists, but there's not much to say about them here in an introductory course. The Solutrean toolkit produced the biggest innovation in stone tool technology since the invention of the biface more than 1,000,000 years before, pressure flaking. Always before, stone tools had been made by direct percussion, the direct striking of the stone with a hard object, usually another stone. That's good for large work, but it's extremely difficult for very small, fine work. You can only remove large flakes, and it's rather difficult to predict their shape and size. Solutrean flint knappers invented pressure flaking, the removing of a flake by applying steady pressure with a pointed implement, usually an antler tine. This allowed much smaller flakes to be removed in a much more controlled manner. Pressure flakes are often only maybe a millimeter or so across. After using direct percussion to create the rough shape of the tool, pressure flaking gave it the exact shape and edge needed. Solutrean stone tools were made from about 22,000 to 17,000 years ago. They're the finest produced up to that time. Some of them are so finely made, with flaking so precise and symmetrical, it's hard to believe that they were ever intended as functional objects at all. They were probably ceremonial pieces intended for display instead. The Magdalenian industry was the last of the Upper Paleolithic, from about 17,000 to 10,000 years ago, and was the most sophisticated yet. In addition to bone, ivory, antler, and pressure flaking, Magdalenian tool makers added a variety of even more complex tools. The atlatl appears for the first time. An atlatl is a hooked handle used to throw a spear. It greatly enhances the speed, accuracy, and force of the spear, and it makes safe hunting at a distance practical. Instead of getting right up next to the animals, as Neanderthals had to do, Homo sapiens could stand safely back and throw spears from a distance. And since the atlatl greatly increased the accuracy and force of the spear, their hunting was also more efficient. Today, archaeology geeks have resurrected the atlatl, and competitive atlatl is a thing. To give you a sense of how effective the atlatl is, consider this. The current world record atlatl throw for distance is 283 yards, nearly the length of 3 football fields. Now that's the record for distance, not accuracy. But if a single spear can fly that far, imagine how devastating it would be at 20 yards. At the end of the Magdalenian, European groups may also have invented the bow and arrow. There is some debate over whether this innovation dates to the very end of the Upper Paleolithic or the very beginning of the next period, the Mesolithic, but really that's of little consequence. The bow and arrow would remain the most effective hunting weapon until the invention of firearms about 11,000 years later. Despite all that, it is another advanced flint knapping technique that was the most useful for Magdalenian toolkits. Neanderthals had used prepared core techniques like the Levallois technique to control the shapes of flakes. Magdalenian toolmakers perfected the technique with the manufacture of blades via indirect percussion, what your textbook calls the punch blade technique. Instead of hitting the stone directly, you hit a punch, which transfers the force of the blow at the precise angle and location you choose. This technique combines aspects of prepared cores, direct percussion, and pressure flaking with a super sophisticated understanding of how stone works. Using a prepared core and indirect percussion, you can create blades, long, narrow flakes with straight, parallel sides. Blades are essentially stone razors. In fact, they're often sharper than steel razor blades, and a large core can produce hundreds. Blade technology then allowed the smallest amount of stone to produce the largest amount of cutting edge. Magdalenian people could spend less of their time hunting for raw material and more concentrating on other tasks. The last thing I'll cover is Paleolithic art. I mentioned this when we looked at Neanderthals, who had very little in the way of art, and that suggested that they were not capable of sophisticated symbolic thought. Homo sapiens in the Upper Paleolithic, however, created art everywhere. Your book covers several of the most famous and familiar kinds: cave paintings, Venus figurines, portable art like carved bones. All I'll say about this is that it is finally definitive proof that our ancestors were fully behaviorally modern. There's no aspect of modern human behavior that's not present in the Upper Paleolithic. After millions of years of evolution, we can finally stop talking about where we came from and start focusing on who we are now.